Well, what we know is that Hobson Development, which is another Chinese developer, could be buying 51%, so a controlling stake in China Evergrande's property management unit. So that's one of the most profitable assets that Evergrande has on the books. And it's important because it's really the first major sign of progress when it comes to kind of clearing up that, as you mentioned, that mountain of liabilities that Evergrande has, of course, in kind of from everything from public bonds that are traded all over the world, but also for these kind of commercial bills and spread out across this vast supplier and contractor network over China.
So not just a partial buyout, a basic takeover of the company?
Yeah, so it would sort of essentially have the controlling stake. And it's sort of interesting because Hobson Development is a sort of owned by another big Guangdong billionaire tycoon, of course. And there have been some attempts previously. There's chatter about other developers coming in to try and buy a stake. But this seems to be certainly the most close that they've come. So local media reporting, as you mentioned, they're valuing that entire deal at about $5.1 billion US.
And is that going to be enough to save the company if it is supposedly on the sort of house of cards?
Well, on the one hand, of course, this is all about how quickly Evergrande can raise this cash to kind of stave off these imminent payments that it's facing, across these various forms of debt that it holds. On the other hand, of course, there is more than $300 billion of worth of liabilities. That's just what Evergrande has reported on its balance sheet. And potentially, of course, there are these fears that there is more kind of hidden debt beyond that. So I think, in the longer term, certainly it's going to take something much bigger than this. But the story of Evergrande for sort of 10 to 15 years now has always been kind of getting very close to the brink of a liquidity crisis, but always being able to manage to save itself. So I think that's really what folks are wondering, whether Evergrande can kind of pull it out of the hat.
Yeah. Now, interestingly enough, one of Evergrande's big rivals, Fantasia, has also missed a critical repayment. How important is that? And does it point to a deepening fragility in the sector?
Absolutely. I think that's totally right. We are seeing that China developers are showing more and more signs of stress. We had a very high profile large default at the beginning of the year, and it's essentially off the back of these sort of so-called 3 red line metrics. Beijing has moved to really clamp down on leverage in the property sector, and it's part of this kind of broader campaign of the common prosperity, this idea that property is not for speculation, but it's for living in, and this focus on trying to close the wealth gap.
And to that point, I mean, do you think there has been speculation, though, that Beijing has been pushing some of these other big state-backed developers and companies to bail Evergrande out? Because even though that is the push, this common prosperity, this could seriously undermine China's economy should it collapse.
Yes, I mean, property in many ways is sort of the growth engine for China and its GDP. And so the risk with Evergrande, it's really, one of China's largest developers. It's the biggest issuer of junk bonds in Asia. And the risk, of course, is that it creates systemic risk and contagion across financial markets, but also across China's economy. And so, of course, regulators are acutely interested in preventing that systemic risk. But it is a very delicate dance. As you say, they also want to clamp down on this type of sort of excessive borrowing over the last few years. And they want to introduce more discipline and more financial discipline into kind of these companies that have had these sort of gone on these debt-fueled spending sprees over the last 15 years.
Yeah. And we know that property is one of those areas. There's reports of 90 million apartments being vacant across China because of that kind of speculation and property boom. When you're talking about common prosperity, what does it start telling us about this broader approach in China? What industries are going to thrive?
Well, I think there's three big sort of focuses for Beijing when it comes to common prosperity. The first is property, the second education, and the third is sort of healthcare. And we have seen regulators move to kind of clamp down on, excessive spending and some of the billionaires that are connected to all three of those sectors. I mean, and when we're kind of just thinking about that in the context of Evergrande, once again, the focus is really going to be sort of making sure that ultimately retail investors investors who were exposed to these sort of wealth management products that were sold by Evergrande that prompted these protests in China, as well as the 1.6 million homes that Evergrande is said to still be building. I think the focus is going to be on making sure that those people don't ultimately lose out. So even if we do see some kind of moves by the authorities to kind of manage this crisis, ultimately, really, Beijing will be focused on protecting the kind of mom and pop retail investors here.
Rebecca, appreciate your analysis. Thanks so much for joining us.